What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. About 10 months ago, I picked up my first ever Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K camera. I've used it for a handful of projects since I picked it up, so I figured this would be a perfect opportunity to talk about my experience with it. So let's get into it. So before we actually get into today's video, it would mean a lot to me if you hit the like button and subscribe down below. I'm really trying to grow this YouTube channel, so liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing, all of that actually does help, and I really do appreciate it. So without further ado, let's actually get into today's video. So like I said earlier, 10 months ago, I picked up my first ever Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K camera. It's a mouthful, I know. I actually dropped a video talking about this camera not too long after purchasing it, and I spoke about my goals and my intentions and why I felt like buying the camera. So if you want to know more about that, go check out that video. Since I've already used this camera for a handful of projects, I figured this would be a perfect opportunity to talk about some of the things I liked about it, as well as some of the things I've disliked about it within the 10 months that I've owned it. The first thing we're gonna be talking about is the image quality. Now, the image quality that comes out of this camera is just absolutely amazing. I shoot both RAW and ProRes on this camera, and the fact that it's able to shoot 4K at 60 frames per second in RAW video, as well as ProRes, and shoot 120 frames per second in 1080, for me, that just kind of sells me on the camera, because both my Sony a7 III and my Sony a7C, which is the current camera that I'm filming on, are not capable of shooting 4K in slow motion. And I feel like it's something that's kind of been holding a lot of my projects back. And I really do have to say that the image quality that comes out of this camera, both in ProRes and RAW, is really just fantastic. So the next thing I like about this camera is it makes me think differently. Now, keep in mind, this is a cinema camera. It's in the title. It is the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera. The thing with cinema cameras is everything is manual. I'm talking your white balance, your ISO, your focusing, your audio channels, your audio levels. All of that is manual, and you have to adjust them in the camera before shooting. My Sony a7C, which is the camera that I'm currently filming on, if I wanted to, I could literally just turn that camera on and start recording. All I would have to do is put it in movie mode or put it in auto mode, and it'll do practically everything for me. I don't have to set the white balance. I might have to adjust the audio levels if they're a little bit too high, but I don't have to set the shutter speed. I don't have to set the ISO. I don't have to set my aperture. I don't have to set any of that. I don't even have to worry about my focus, because this camera has such good autofocus. And with this camera, it doesn't have any of that. So it keeps me in check, because anytime I want to use this camera, I have to make sure that all of those are properly adjusted, and it's made me grow. It's made me think instinctively now when I'm filming, not even just with this camera, but when I'm filming with any camera or any of my friends' cameras, instinctively I'm already thinking, okay, are all of my settings correct? Because having gone from a mirrorless camera that pretty much does everything for me to going to something like this, it's just kind of opened my eyes to be more aware of making sure all these settings are good. And I like that, because it challenges me as a videographer and as a filmmaker to step my game up and just make sure that I'm aware of everything that's going on. So the next thing I like about this camera is it makes me change up my film style. Now, as you see, the camera is currently in a small rig cage. Up here, I have a little mount for a solid state drive, because that's my primary source for recording media. Up here, I have a little MPF plate, because I don't use V-mount batteries, because I just haven't invested in them yet. So I use MPF 970 batteries to power the camera. I don't use this camera without the small rig cage. I've never used it without the small rig cage. That's because if I do, I won't have anywhere to store my SSD. I won't have anywhere to put my power supply. So I really don't use the camera unless the small rig cage is on it. And that changed the way I think about filming things, because me personally, I was always somebody that liked to film with a gimbal. Anytime I would go out to film, I always had to make sure that I had the gimbal with me, and primarily I would do everything on it. I would do static shots on it, I would walk around, and I kind of started to become dependent on that. Now, with this camera, not only do I have to have all of these accessories that I mentioned on it, but I have to use a follow focus and set up all these things and come up with a whole configuration anytime I want to use this camera on the gimbal. And I gotta say, it's a very big hassle, and sometimes it's not worth it. Because I need so much to use this camera on the gimbal, it gets very time consuming setting all of that up. And there's been times where I found myself in a situation where I didn't have that time to set up this camera on the gimbal. And I've literally just said, screw it, took the Blackmagic off the gimbal and threw one of my mirrorless cameras on the gimbal, because it meant I could get shots much faster because I didn't have to spend so much time setting it up. It makes me think differently, because there's a lot of shots that you can do without a gimbal, and I was so dependent on solely using a gimbal prior to picking up this camera that I never thought about it. And it's really made me start to implement other tools such as tripods, monopods, or even shooting handheld that I wouldn't have done prior to purchasing this camera. So this camera makes me think differently. Because it's such a hassle to set up on the gimbal sometimes, it makes me come up with other ways to film shots that I might not necessarily would have been able to get using a gimbal. And I gotta say, I really am grateful for that because it's pushed me to another level to think differently when I'm working on all my video projects. All right, so now that I told you the things that I like about this camera, let's talk about some of the things that I don't like about this camera. One of them I already just mentioned to you, which is setting it up on a gimbal can be a huge pain in the ass. It's very time consuming. For more professional people, maybe you guys have it down to a better science, but if I'm traveling somewhere, I don't like to have anything set up. So every time I set this camera up on the gimbal, it is really from scratch. And then if I'm going from one location to the other, it's annoying to just carry it around because I don't want to break it down to then have to set it back up again because it took so long to set up the first time. So setting this camera up on the gimbal can be a huge pain in the ass. Although I do have to say, when I do set it up on the gimbal and I am able to get those shots, it actually is really cool, and I'm happy that I have a tool and that I have a gimbal that is capable of operating this camera. But I do wish it was a little bit easier to set up, and who knows, maybe somewhere down the line I'll come up with a better system. But for right now, I actually do have a system to work around that. If I'm filming with the Blackmagic camera, I will either make sure to have another camera designated towards the gimbal, or if I do have the Blackmagic camera on the gimbal, I'll make sure to have another camera either on a tripod or a monopod. And I actually do have quick release plates on all of my gear, so if I wanted to, I could go back and forth from the gimbal to the tripod. But the main reason for having two cameras, one designated for each thing, is because anytime I set this up to the gimbal, it is hooked up to the gimbal. It has the follow focus on it. It has the battery supply in a completely different spot. The HDMI cable is plugged into a different spot. So if I switch this over to a tripod, yeah, I have a quick release plate, but I also have to transfer over the power supply. I have to transfer over the monitor, and it's a lot more trouble than it's worth sometimes. So my workaround has just been one camera will be designated to the gimbal and another camera will be designated to the tripod or handheld or the monopod. The next thing about my Blackmagic 4K that I dislike is this thing eats storage. Whether I'm shooting ProRes, whether I'm shooting RAW, this thing just destroys all of my storage. I can't use regular SD cards like the 128s I use for my A7C or my A7 III. So I had to figure out what I was gonna do in order to capture media. And at the time of purchase for this camera, I didn't feel like investing in CFast cards, and also didn't feel like having to deal with the process of transferring media from the CFast cards over to solid state drives or to my main G drive or anything like that. So this is what I primarily film with. These are Samsung T5 SSDs. Now, anybody that owns a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, whether it's the 4K, 6K, 6K Pro, you guys already know that these are one of the main sources of recording that a lot of people use. And for me personally, I love that I can just record right to the camera. And if I want to start editing, all of my media is already on there. I just have to put it in a specific folder to separate it from whatever else I record in the future. And I'm already set to go. I open up an Adobe Premiere Pro project right in the solid state drive, and I just get to work immediately. I don't have to deal with transferring over data from the CFast or waiting for such large files to transfer over. It does eat up a lot of my storage. I do tend to go through SSDs pretty quick. Off the top of my head, I think I have like 10 Samsung T5s and a handful of Samsung T7s. And my workflow has just kind of been, once I'm done with a project completely, I'll put it on my G drive and just back everything up on there. That way I can clear it out like I would as if it were an SD card. But it really can be annoying sometimes because if I haven't cleared anything out and I don't have time to wait for stuff to transfer over, then I find myself purchasing a lot of Samsung T5 drives. And although it is a lot cheaper than purchasing a whole bunch of CFast cards every time I run out of storage, it still is kind of annoying having to manage so much data. And it does take a little bit more processing power to actually deal with such large files when I'm editing. So that's another thing that I dislike about this camera. But don't get it twisted, because all of the things that I mentioned are actually not enough to make me get rid of this camera. And I do have to say, I don't see myself selling this camera anytime soon. It's made me level up as a videographer and as a filmmaker, and I look forward to using this camera for a whole bunch of other projects in the future. I don't plan on upgrading to a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K or 6K Pro, and I don't even think I would get one of those as another camera to match this camera or to be like a second angle to that. This camera was really just something to to make me level up as a videographer, and it has been doing just that. 10 months in, I have to say, I really do love this camera. All of the projects that I've used this for, the image quality has just been amazing, and I used it for weddings, I've used it for car videos. Just recently, I did a product video with it, and the image quality was so fantastic. I was so happy with it, and I've used it enough to where it's become second nature. I'm getting used to the buttons on it. I know where all of the shortcuts are. I have everything set up to my liking. So I don't see myself getting rid of it. But let me ask you guys, what do you think of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K in 2021? Especially since from the time I purchased this camera, not only was the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K already out, but maybe about a month after I purchased it, they dropped the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K Pro. Let me guys know what you think in the comments below. Do you think any of these cameras are worth it in 2021? Do you think the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K is worth it over the Blackmagic 6K or 6K Pro? I'm interested in talking about it. Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. All of those things really do mean a lot to me, and they really do help. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.